Evening, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have a chat tonight. Yeah, what I'd like to do is just really take you through a few aspects. And Slade asked me to have a chat about my career and how things led to the creation of the book, the MiG Diaries. And although I haven't had an exceptional career in any sense compared to some other people, I think some of the experiences that I had along the way might be fairly interesting, and they also led to the creation of the book, or also the reasons behind how the book came about. So I'll just take you through a couple of aspects as we go along. Yeah, I started in the Air Force at a very young age, at 17 years old, and I was part of Pilots Course 2 of 83 in the South African Air Force. So I started there in 1983, and yeah, it's a fantastic bunch of guys, and we became literally a bit like the movie, A Band of Brothers. In those days, all of us learned to fly on the Harvard aircraft. It was a real handful. For the very first aircraft you fly, a big 550 horsepower motor, tail dragger. I can't say that any of us really mastered the aircraft during pilot's course or pupes course days, as it was called. The aircraft was more the master of us, but we staggered along and eventually learned how to fly it on our own. The aircraft that I went solo on, it's not this one, but it was Harvard 7289, and funny enough, that's still at the Port Elizabeth Museum, the SAF Museum over there. After you finished the Harvard phase, they put you into various other phases. You can go to helicopters or jets or transport. I actually wanted to go to transport, but they look at your personality profile, and then for some reason they decided I need to go fly jets. So that was off to the next phase, which was at Langebaan in the Western Cape. So once again, we were all young, and this is kind of the official photo, the one you showed to your mom and dad and everything about how it was on pilot's course, and that was more like what it was really like, you know. So yeah, we worked hard, we had a heck of a lot of fun, and we learned to fly that little jet, the Impala, magic little aeroplane. Very simple, very easy to fly, less easy to use it in its actual role, but we learned a lot along the way. And I was 19 years old at that stage, so 19 years old, solo in a little jet, and then I actually completed my final wings test when I was still 19 years old. And when I look at a 19-year-old now, I think, oh my goodness, what were they thinking? So yeah, but managed to survive. On to the next phase, and once we'd finished wings, at that stage South Africa was very involved in the Angolan War and also the war in Namibia. And it was basically from there off to operational squadron. So I was sent off to the Bosbok squadron, which is mainly involved in reconnaissance. I used to fly a light aircraft from Italy, from the same stable actually as the Impala. If you look in the cockpit, you'll be fully at home, and if you've flown an Impala, you'll be fully at home in the cockpit of a Bosbok. And the Bosbok filled a variety of roles in the war. When we started on the Bosbok, I wasn't too impressed with it. I didn't think it was a particularly great aircraft, and I wanted to go fly DC-3s because I wanted to go to the Airline and that kind of thing. But came to absolutely love the aircraft. It had beautiful visibility, was very responsive, it could pull up to about 5 Gs. An extremely useful aircraft in the role of the bush war. And we were trained in a variety of factors rather. Artillery fire control, mortar fire control, rocket delivery for forward air control, flare dropping, and we were just really a jack of all trades. And that was really the kind of war in which we were involved in. That's how it looked in northern Namibia. That's at Okongwati. We worked a lot with the helicopter guys in those days, very close links between the light aircraft Bosbok guys and the helicopter guys. And there were two phases to the war. There was the counterinsurgency war, and there was the more conventional war, which took place deep in Angola near the Lomba River. So the Bosbok was one of the few aircraft that was involved in both. As a youngster, it was actually being dropped in the deep end. You know, if you went to helicopters, you flew as a co-pilot on Pumas. If you went to jets, you flew as a wingman. But on the Bosbok, you would just set off on your own. 20 years old, off to the bush war, there you go. And you just got to find your way. That's how we lived. We lived low level the whole time. There's a photo I took of the Bosbok near the Kuneni River. And that's really what our war looked like. Staying low level, spotting, reconnaissance, calling in the helicopters if need be, or wherever else you needed to sort the situation out. As I said, it filled a variety of roles. And one of the roles that I found to be, in my whole career, after 40 years of flying, the most demanding flying role that I ever did was forward air control. So you'd fly this little Bosbok at between 50 and 200 foot. If there was a target, you had to then, on the map, while you're flying, find an initial point for the jets to come in, plot a heading, plot a distance, plot a pitch-up point, give the jets the coordinates of the initial point, the IP. When they hit the IP, then you've got to talk them in. You tell them, okay, leave the IP on this heading. If I'll either pitch you on time or I'll pitch you on site, and then you had to pitch up yourself to about 1,000 foot, 800 foot, deliver smoke rockets as close to the target as possible, dive away again, and try to pick the mirages or impalas coming in. Very difficult with the mirages because they move at 540 knots, 9 nautical miles a minute, about 17 kilometers a minute. The only way to get them visual is to get lower than them, and they're already low, and then speak them onto the target. So it was really quite challenging flying, and I really enjoyed it. That's a Bosbok 926, quite a special Bosbok to me. It's still flying in South Africa. That was the Bosbok that I first did my first solo flight on a Bosbok on. My first operational flight out of Ondangwa was on 926, and the first time I saw any kind of contact with Alouettes and Kufit, and quite a big contact, was flying Bosbok 926. So we go back some way. That artwork is by Sean Thackeray, because in the book, the MiG Diaries, this was also the Bosbok that had the MiGs come flying right past us at one stage. That's a forward air controller course in 1987. And at this stage, I learned one of the biggest lessons in my young life. So that's me over there, check the hair. And then next to me, a guy called Richard Glynn. Richard Glynn was a superb pilot, one of the best pilots I ever worked with, and a very close friend of mine. Richard and I were on this course together, and then later on, we were sitting on Ondangwa, the 3rd of September 1987. We're both sitting in Ondangwa, and a call came, said, 2 Bosbok pilots must immediately go across to Rundu, come to the ops room. So we went to the ops room, and they said to us, okay, the war's getting really big now. One of you guys is going to go to Mavinga to go do a artillery fire control mission over the Lomba River. The other one of you guys is going to go to Rundu to be on standby. Of course, youngsters, 21 years old, what do you want to do? You want the mission to the Lomba River, Mavinga. So we had a big argument about who was going to go to Rundu and who was going to go to Mavinga. So it ended up in rock, paper, scissors. Richard won, I lost. He wasn't humble in victory, I wasn't gracious in defeat, so we left on less than good terms. He went straight off to Mavinga, relieved Jeff Rogers. That night he took off over the Lomba River. Before midnight he was dead, shot down by the same 8s. That no one knew the same 8s were in the area. It was a one-way mission. He was never coming back from that mission. So I learned a lesson then that sometimes when you think you've lost, you've actually won. And sometimes when you think you've won, you've actually lost. So I've had all these extra years of life just from losing rock, paper, scissors, which was a lesson to me. Time came for the end of my Bosbok time. 1988, moved off onto the helicopter phase of my life. Alouette course in Bloemfontein. That's James O'Connell. Some of you might have seen that accident with Impala recently at the air show in South Africa. That was James O'Connell was flying, unfortunately, that day. Alouette course was a lot of fun, and then went off to the mighty Puma. There's a lot of people in this room who might have more hours on the Puma than me, certainly Slade has, but what a magnificent machine. One of the best machines I had the fortune to fly in my career. So off onto Pumas, and when I was on Pumas, another thing happened that made a deep impression on me later on, and also helped lead to the book. Mike Hill, is over there, was one of the best guys I ever worked with. So he was the commander that day, I was the co-pilot. And it was Christmas Eve, December the 24th, 1988. We got a mission to work. At that stage, they were busy with the peace negotiations. So we got a mission to fly with the Joint Monitoring Commission. So we had to fly off to what was called the cut line, which was no man's land. And there we had to meet up with some Angolan helicopter pilots. So the Angolan helicopters flew in their top brass, we flew in our top brass. Then we landed on no man's land, the cut line. Half of their brass would climb onto our Puma, and half of our brass would climb onto their Dauphine. And then we would do this inspection, flying down the cut line, checking out various places. And every time we stopped, we would start chatting to the Angolan pilots. And we had 10 stops during the day. And we just became really on good terms with them. We started sharing rat packs. They offered us a few beers. We said, oh, thanks, we'll take them, but we can only drink them tonight. And we got on really well with them. And round about mid to late afternoon, our helicopters all became a bit short of fuel because we'd been doing all these hops. So we had to fly the helicopters empty to a refueling station. Mike went to them and said, listen, we're flying these helicopters empty, no one on board. how about we swap co-pilots? And, yeah. So they went into a bit of a huddle, we went in the huddle, and they said, fantastic. So I jumped into the Dolphin as a co-pilot to Carlos, and that co-pilot there is Lolix. He flew the Puma with Mike. There was nobody on board. We were all pretty experienced, so we jumped off and off we flew. And that's a photo of me flying the Dolphin taken by Mike from the Puma. And here's these guys that just weeks, months before we were at war with, and now we were swapping flights. So it was just the most amazing day. At the end of the day, we were like really good mates. You know, if it had been the days of WhatsApp, we would have been sharing photos and had a WhatsApp group going, you know. And so it's just crazy. It just showed me how crazy the whole concept of war is, and how pilots everywhere are actually just part of a broader brotherhood, or these days also sisterhood. Of course, we couldn't tell anybody about this, and I kept these photos secret for years. You know, Mike's Hill's unfortunately no longer with us. But yeah, so when we got back that day, we landed, and remember it was Christmas Eve. And remember that story about the guys playing soccer on no man's land on Christmas Eve? It felt a little bit like that to me. We got back to Ondangwa, and we parked the Puma, and we just sat down there and watched the sunset. And I just said to Mike, you know, I don't know if I can go back to war with these guys. You know, we've been at war for so many years. And I remember him sitting there, and he just looked at his camera that had all these memories of the day on it. And he just said to me, yeah, Lionel, I think I'm ready for Civvy Street as well. And it was for me, it was quite a defining moment. Then, and very shortly afterwards, I left the Air Force. Being part of a peacetime Air Force also didn't appeal to me, because although I wasn't in love with war, the fact is a peacetime Air Force has got no funds, and you hardly fly. So it was time to launch into the civilian world, which is a whole new world in itself. The little air school was starting up in the Eastern Cape called 43 Air School. I only had 4 instructors. I was one of them. And now I think it's one of the biggest air schools in Africa, maybe. So I had a lot of fun there, learning all thing. And then a chance came to fly DC-3s. I've always wanted to fly in the Air Force, never got a chance. And now I could fly around Africa. Luckily, I've got dual nationality, and they were looking for pilots with bush experience, dual nationality, who could fly into Africa. Bear in mind, this was 1991, so South Africa still wasn't as accepted as what it could be. So we went off into Sudan. So we were the first South Africans to be based out of northern Lokichogio, flying into Sudan, flying into some really, really dodgy and strange places. Sudan was absolute, it was chaos in those days. The war had 3 warring factions, and whichever one of them came across each other just opened fire. It was, it was an interesting time. So the DC-3 TP, lovely aircraft, could really utilize it. And might be some guys here, that's Andre White, who sadly just also passed away recently. Andre there. Fantastic guy, really great pilot. Myself, no guy, Fido Crosby or Neil Crosby. Some really interesting characters I flew with there. I remember we flew into this one field called Nasir. So the war was still going. They would give us a small window when the MiGs would leave us alone, and we could fly into this airfield, drop off the supplies for United Nations and fly out again. And the one threshold for this airfield was about a 15-foot bank of a big tributary of the Nile River. It was 500 meters long, and the overrun area was an uncleared minefield. So, those of you who've ever instructed and you know, you tell your student to try land on the threshold, well, you didn't need to tell anyone. You needed to touch down on the threshold, you know, to like really put it on the markers. So, but a really good growth experience. And the whole area was pretty wild in those days. Then it was on to the proper airline world, and Kome, tiny airline then, 20 pilots, 32 air hostesses. We had a lot of fun. But we flew the F-27, also known as the 20-ton dog whistle. It was weighed 20 tons, and it had this high-pitched whine from the centrifugal intakes of its engine. And then finally, SAA hadn't had a selection for 4 years, finally managed to get in there. Initially a boy pilot on the 747, then later on onto the A300 as a co-pilot. Wonderful aircraft, I really, really enjoyed it. And then I was lucky enough to be selected to go on an 8-week skiing course. So this skiing course was going to take place in Seattle in Washington State in America. Never skied in my life before, so we had to disguise the course as a 767 conversion. So the bean counters would never have let us go. So off we all went to Seattle, and we arrived there, and yeah, look, it was tough, you know. So we found starting to be very dehydrating, even though it was the middle of winter. So we took the precautions. We always had sufficient liquids around and went through the manuals. Yeah, as I said, the course was tough. Skiing's not as easy as it looks. It's really, it's quite difficult at times. But we had instructors that were prepared to work with us into the early hours of the morning, you know, on the finer points of skiing. And to keep the disguise going, from Monday morning till Friday morning, we had to attend simulator and all that kind of stuff, so we could ski from Friday afternoon to Sunday afternoon. And yeah, we just had a wonderful ball. At the end of it, great success. We were all signed out on the black slopes, even the black diamond slopes, and we had been to every pub between Seattle and Mount Rainier, which is 100 kilometers away. And fortunately, at the end, someone in Boeing gave us a certificate saying we could fly 767s, which was convenient because when we got back, there were going to be a lot of awkward questions as to where we'd been for the last 8 weeks. So yeah, so finally I started flying the 767, and it's probably the best aircraft, definitely the best airliner I ever flew. Had 6 years on the 767. Wonderful time, wonderful people. As you know, Don Pingeli is Uncle Don. So we had trips all over the place. We went to the Maldives. This was a trip to Entebbe. So they said to us, you know, don't do anything dangerous or risky on night stops. So we didn't want to push our luck and walk through the botanical garden. So we went whitewater rafting on the Nile. So we did a few of those trips. And it was, some of the best fun I ever had in my whole airline career. So Uncle Don's in the boat there somewhere at some stage. And myself. Yeah, he was ballast, yeah. Everything. That was my last flight on the 767. After 6 years, sadly, all good things come to an end. And I had to move off onto the A340, which was also fun. So we arrived in Toulouse. Everyone arrived in Toulouse. The 380 wasn't flying yet. So if you arrived in Toulouse, they put you in front of a model of the 380 because they're trying to promote it, and then took a photo. So also Don Pingeli again. So myself and Don were paired up together in the simulator, and we formed a great team. Don was good at the talking stuff, and I concentrated on the flying stuff. And it worked really well. And then it was time for me to grow up and become a captain. I went off into the 737-800, and also it was just a magic jet. And had a lot of fun flying the 737-800 for many years. And yeah, I had some interesting experience. That one I just put in as an interesting side. We were flying from Johannesburg to Lilongwe, just thunderstorms all around, the middle of summer. And somewhere through the middle part of Mozambique, our weather radar system completely failed. We had line squalls all ahead, so we ducked into the only place we could find an opening, which was Harare. And that's what Harare looked like just about 2 or 3 minutes after we landed without a weather radar. So it could have been a bit tricky if we were a few minutes later. Just another interesting photo, Mango, for those of you who know. That aircraft had an incident where it actually hit another aircraft in a parking bay when they were busy maneuvering a Comair aircraft, and they had to replace the wingtip with a Mango wingtip. So it's quite a unique photo, SAA 737 with Mango wingtip. And that was my last flight on the 737. It was time to leave the 737 and move across to Airbus. SAA at that stage was becoming almost a purely Airbus airline. Yeah, at that stage I could have gone to the long range or international flying, but my children were very young. I had kids fairly late in life, so back to another domestic type. But I really enjoyed the A320. It's an honest jet, it's a really nice jet, and it's a lot of fun. At that stage, storm clouds were gathering in SAA. We all knew trouble was coming. But yeah, having young kids, had to just decide to stay in SAA and just see what the ride went like. And then COVID hit. We all know what that did to the airline industry, and even worse to SAA, because SAA was on such a shaky foundation as it was. So SAA, the old SAA, was never going to survive COVID. And yeah, basically the end came, and I was one of the people who ferried one of the last A320s off to Europe, back to the Lissors, and that was on the ferry flight just during the night stop in Accra and flying at daytime over the Sahara Desert. And that was on final approach to a little airfield called Nîmes in France, and that's where all the aircraft were going to be parked, or many of the SA aircraft were going to be parked. And when I flew in there, as I came in, I knew this is probably my last landing in SAA. And when we parked there, everything was like a ghost town. We left the aircraft there, they all get boarded up and shut up. And I thought, well, that's it. It's all over. So I took the package from SAA. It had become quite a toxic environment at that stage, with a lot of fighting between various parties and management. And it was time for a new start outside of SA. So one of the airlines I flew for after that in 2021 was called Star Air Cargo. They just did a lot of cargo flying because freight never got COVID. Passenger flying did. But flew some contracts out of Mozambique, and this particular passenger contract was out of Mozambique. And then some freight flying into some really interesting places. A little airfield called Tolignaro or Fort Dauphine. It's right on the south of Madagascar. Tiny little airfield there. We used to fly mining supplies in there. And by the time the aircraft was offloaded, it was too late to take off. And we were also out of flight and duty. So every time we flew into Tolignaro, we weren't allowed even into the airport building because of COVID at that stage. So we took blow-up mattresses and sleeping bags and a bottle of wine and some lasagna, and we would literally camp on board the 737. And it was the best fun. You know, such a contrast to SAA, where if you get downgraded to a 4-star hotel, the guys start filing safety reports. You know, it's like so it was a big change. When that contract ended, there weren't too many other jobs around at that stage. There were Middle East and overseas, which I didn't want. Took about a year sabbatical, and that's when I really started finishing off the MiG Diaries. And then suddenly a chance came to fly for another airline called Safe. And strange enough, I was flying ex-SAA 737-800s for a different airline. I was the first person to do the takeoff in this one, which was the one that had just come out the hangars, being painted in the colors for the World Cup. So when the World Cup took place, that's the one, when the Springboks came back from winning that World Cup, this is the aircraft that they went touring the country in. So it was a lovely experience just to do the first takeoff in that one in a rather special livery. Thought I'd be staying at SAFE, and then SAA suddenly discovered that if you need to expand, funny enough, you need pilots. And they started contacting a lot of the pilots who had left and asked us to come back. So thought about it for a while, and it was a chance to do international flying again. So I came back to SAA. It was a bit strange coming back to an airline as a co-pilot where you've been a senior captain for 16 years before. But in the end, you know, it's more about the lifestyle than about your ego. And I must say, since I've been back flying the A340 on the Perth route, it's been good, really enjoyable. Getting back to that gap that I had when I could finish the book or work on the book with a whole lot of people, that's when finally got to finish the MiG Diaries, and also just had time. I could work, I could research, I could go out, I could interview people. No longer had a roster that I was bound to. And that in many ways was what caused me to finish a book and get the whole thing up and running. Yeah, so how did a pilot who knew nothing about writing end up involved in a book? Well, the MiG Diaries had an interesting start in some way. I started researching some aspects, and I came across a story about a MiG pilot who had nearly shot down a SAF Hercules one night. And we'd always been told that, you know, the Cubans were full of nonsense, always exaggerating things. And I thought, well, that's strange, because in 1986, I was in the bush, in Ondangwa, and there's no ways that we had a Hercules that was nearly shot down. So I went into Dick Lord's books, and it said on that date when they said this MiG almost shot down a Hercules, that a Hercules was narrowly missed by a surface-to-air missile. I thought, yeah, that's interesting. And finally I got the email address of a Cuban pilot who said he'd been the guy who launched the missile. And I emailed him, and he said, well, shoot, boss, what do you want to know? And he gave me the exact launch parameters, his speeds, his height, the time of thing. And then I looked up to see who'd been flying that Hercules. Turns out Mark Binu had been one of the guys flying the Hercules that night. So I approached Mark, and I said to Mark, what can you remember? Can you tell me anything about the speeds, times, altitudes, height? And whatever he gave me was a carbon copy of what the Cuban MiG pilot had given me. I thought, that's impossible, I think. So put together, and they just dovetailed. And I realized that had actually happened, that a MiG had nearly shot down one of our Hercules that night. And at the same time, I realized, but goodness me, if we were so wrong about what we thought about the Cubans' ability to intercept aircraft at night, what else were we wrong about? And that caused me to start digging and digging. And that was really the final genesis of the book. There's the co-author of the book, a very good friend of mine, and now, funny enough, a very good friend of Mark's, Eduardo Gonzalez Saria, and we decided to work together on the book. And one rule: no politics, no who was right, who was wrong in the war, that thing. Just the story of the pilots, told by the pilots who were there at the time. Why the MiG Diaries? Because the MiG side of the story was the side that had been told the least. Dick Lord, in his books, Fledging to Eagle and Vlam Gat, had told the South African side. Not always 100% correctly, because Dick, as excellent as he was, he didn't have the same access to the information as what we had. It started to turn out that as I unlocked, I came across people from Angola that were willing to talk to me, so I started getting in contact with Angolan pilots we'd fought against. Even one of the chopper pilots that I'd met decades ago. Even got talking to some of the Soviet pilots. And the Cuban pilots opened up through Ed. And then, obviously, all the SAF pilots I knew from my time. And I started sitting down with all these guys, doing interviews. Ed would do interviews on his side. And when I started pooling this information together, a quite remarkable and very different story of the air war started to evolve. And we realized we just got to share it. So in the beginning, there weren't many photos. It was very tough to find photos. So we realized the book needed more of a visual impact. And a superb artist in South Africa, Sean Thackeray. He's an ex-Air Force pilot, cheetah pilot, ex-SAA pilot, and now currently aerobatic pilot for the Flying Lions team. He agreed to do the artwork. So what I'll do is I'll send him chapters, and he would just take a chapter, and whatever image came into his mind from reading the chapter, he would sketch it, and that would bring the chapters to life. Luckily, we started to unlock more and more photos as the project went along. But Sean's artwork remains key. Tim Richmond, he was the publisher. And from the get-go, the first publisher I approached, he just believed in the project from the outset. We didn't want to approach any of the big publishers, because the big publishers like Jonathan Ball, we would have just been a small cog in a big wheel, and they would have told us exactly how to write this book. Whereas Tim said, how do you guys want to write this book, and I'll help you. And we were very, very lucky to work with Tim. So the book itself, it's really just a collaborative team effort. It's just so many people that work together to make the book happen. A concept that occurred to me, the more I researched, the more I checked things out, is the quote by Douglas MacArthur. Just became so apt. And he said, in war, you win or you lose. You live or you die. And the difference is but an eyelash. And it just occurred to me that so often there were combats that could have gone either way, incidents that could have gone either way. I thought back to Richard Glynn on that night, and I thought, my whole life, my whole career could have gone either way. It was but an eyelash, you know, a scissors versus a rock, type of thing. So that just occurred to me more and more. This particular incident is in February 1988, where we nearly lost a Mirage F1AZ to a MiG. They were bounced by Eladio Alvera. Eladio had them on a platter. He had David Kleinans and Reg van Eden on an absolute platter, especially David. And he never fired. David said to me when he said, Lionel, for 30 years I've wondered, why did that MiG not kill me? Turned out Eladio had his one little switch in the wrong position. So when he came down, he split airst onto the tail, and by the time he realized the switch was in the wrong position and he flicked it, David and Reg had seen him and they were on the break. David Kleinans, the Mirage pilot there. So that's David Kleinans and that's Reg van Eden flying those. Another incident in February as well where we nearly shot down a MiG. It was a guy called Trompinel. And he had the MiG dead to rights, pulled the trigger, the missile didn't launch. By the time he'd flicked over to the other missile, the opportunity had gone. The angles weren't as good anymore. Very famous day, 30th of September 1985. The SAF shot down 3 helicopters in a matter of minutes and destroyed another one on the ground. But that whole result almost never took place, because here you can see Wayne Westerby closing in on a Mi-24 rather, flown by Didi Pangila, and about to shoot it down. But just back there, when Wayne was slotting behind the helicopter, he was low level on the Lomba River, he got so low, fixated on the chopper, that when he looked out on the right-hand side, his tip tank was running through the bulrushes, physically touching the bulrushes. A matter of inches, and he would have plowed into the Lomba River. The whole attack would have been called off. And in the end, that day went the SAF's way. It could have so easily gone the other way. So it's just the whole concept of but an eyelash. The story I'd like to take you through, or the chapter I'd like to take you through, is one where but an eyelash, Mark Binyu might not even be here tonight. There's a small little town called Kalasinga, very deep into Angola, north of Huambo. So what happened was that they started to find that the local population were wrapping their children onto their back in parachute material. They quickly worked out, well, somebody must be doing supply drops. So that whole area was a UNITA stronghold. They didn't know who was doing these supply drops. They suspected that it might be the CIA coming in from Kamina base. It actually was the SAF coming up from Grootfontein, coming up and curving around. But it didn't matter who it was, they wanted to shoot these guys down, whoever was doing the supply drops. So they snuck a mobile radar station onto the hills in Andulo and started monitoring this area to try to see who was coming in and doing these supply drops. Eduardo Gonzalez Sarria was actually the guy in charge of the MiG side of things. So they started training low-level intercepts at night. Now, understand that we thought the Cubans didn't even fly at night, but they had actually had quite an extensive night flying program. And Eduardo was one of their top night flying guys. So they started working with the radar, and the whole area there got a lot of high ground. So it was quite tricky flying. They started to work together with the radar, fly lower and lower, and cover the area, getting ready for when these guys would come again. And they knew that whoever did these supply drops only did them during dark moon, never did it during a full moon. Now, during the night training, as Ed said, it was pretty tricky. You'll see quite an interesting photo here. You'll see the stencil work there is in English on a MiG in Angola. And the reason was that this MiG was originally destined for delivery to Libya, and then it was diverted from there to the Angolan War from the MiG factory. So the guys who were doing the drops were 28 Squadron. And the 28 Squadron guys had developed a lot of expertise in doing these night drops. It was difficult flying. And they worked a really good crew concept where the navigator would give a lot of information to the pilots. They would fly along at night, 400 or 500 foot above the ground, and come up to the drop zones. The drop zone in itself was another tricky affair. There you go, Mark Binu, a young Mark Binu, and Russell S.B. Jones, sadly just passed away recently from cancer. They were young Hercules commanders, and they were busy getting their check flights out that night. To become fully qualified on these night drops, you had to be checked out by the senior pilots or the senior instructors. Hercules 401, I managed to find, courtesy a guy called Paul Dubois, these photos from Hercules 401 when it was first delivered to the South African Air Force. So Mark was in Hercules 401 that night, sitting in the left seat. Adrian Woodley in the right-hand seat, checking him out. Hercules 402, Russell S.B. Jones was there, and he was also being checked out by one of the senior instructors. So the route, they came right from south, from Grootfontein, and that is all high ground there. So their track is these blue lines. So the only way to get to the drop zone near Kalasinga was to curve all the way around the high ground. One of the disadvantages of this routing was that they had to go back the same way, because after the drop they couldn't cut through there. They had to backtrack and go all the way around, which they preferred not to do, but that night they had no choice. The red that you see there, later on we'll get to that, that's the MiG that was intercepting them. So the MiGs were waiting to see who was going to do these drops, and the MiGs were on standby in Huambo. And the MiGs that night were armed with a missile called the R-24. That's R-24R, it's radar guided, and it's quite a formidable missile, the R-24. It's about 240 kilograms. Accelerates to Mach 3.5, it's got about a 30 kilogram warhead. You really don't want to be on the wrong side of it. And on the other wing, so that was R-24, other side, same size missile, the R-24T. That is infrared missile, so it's thermally guided. It initially acquires its lock via the radar, and once it gets the thermal signal locked on, the radar helps the thermal head to pick up the target. Once the thermal head's locked on, you can launch it, it becomes autonomous. So those were the two missiles the MiGs were armed with that night. Yeah, suddenly, around about midnight, 4th of April, 1986, the radar picked up two blips coming in and told the MiGs scramble. So Ed was just flying as a singleton, because you can only operate in those conditions as a singleton at night. The other MiG would be on standby in case something happened to Ed. So yeah, it's always jokes about Ed about that expression on his face, but that was taken just before one of those low-level nighttime training sorties, and you can see the intensity of the sortie that's ahead. Ed was scrambled. That's his time markers, 12 minutes, 13 things. He was scrambled towards his Hercules. In the meantime, the Hercules had reached their drop zone, had done their drop, and were turning around. Of course, no story is complete without a chopper pilot, so I'll put that in for sight. So it says now he's running along at night in between these hills, and they've got a search and rescue chopper on standby. But of course, by midnight, any search and rescue helicopter pilots got completely bored and started drinking rum, like any good Cuban does. So he said when the search and rescue chopper came onto the radio, he could hear the slurring. He just thought, tonight I cannot crash because there's going to be no search and rescue. How did these drops work? So these were pallets. So it was the PLEDS, the Platform Load Extraction Delivery System. So it was 2 or 3 very big pallets that were in the back. And as they got to the drop zone, they would come in on a downwind, and then overhead where the fires were, you need to put out fires. As the guys would fly overhead the fires, at a certain point, they would get the load master to release a drogue chute in the back. The drogue chute would pull out the main chute, and then off the drop would happen. So you can see there's the actual platform, or the pallet. There's the drogue chute, and there's the main chute about to snap open. These main chutes were huge, between 60 to 100-foot canopies. When the drogue chute started pulling those pallets out the back, they would reach a speed of about 150 kilometers per hour. It would just be dust, and then there'd be maybe 3 pallets. Each pallet would be attached to the pallet next. So once the first pallet goes, it's unstoppable. You can't stop. All 3 are going to go. And if one of them gets caught on the ramp, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. So it was quite a tricky exercise. As Rusty Erasmus, the flight engineer who used to supervise a lot of these drops in the back, would say if there was going to be mistakes, there would be blood, and it would be our blood. So it was really a time of high concentration. So once the drop was done, the Hercules guys had been briefed. MiGs don't fly at night, there's no missiles in the area. They thought the most dangerous part of the night was over. So they closed up the ramp, started accelerating, formed up again, and started relaxing as you do after high-intensity activity. In the meantime, the MiG was closing in on them. And Eduardo got vectored on. He picked the Hercules up on his radar and closed to within the required distance. His missile locked on, got all the locks, and he launched his first missile. That's the radar-guided missile, R-24R. As the missile launched, he said it was like a sun came up on the side of the aircraft, just a blinding sun, and the missile shot off in the night. And in the distance, he saw an explosion, not a very convincing one. He wasn't sure if it was what the explosion was. And then the radar controller said, no, you've got them, because the Hercules blip disappeared from the screen. Probably the Hercules was just being shielded by some high ground, because the Hercules guys just carried on. No missile went past them. They just had no idea that a missile had been launched at them. So they were just going along, carrying on their route back now, totally unaware that there were a bunch of excited Cubans trying to kill them, you know. So it then turned away, and nothing of that. When it got to about that point about there, the radar controller said, I've picked them up again. You know, go maximum speed. So Ed went into full afterburner, pickled his drop tank and turned around. So round about here, accelerated about Mach 1.3. He was worried that the window to get to the Hercs was diminishing. He came in behind them over here, still couldn't pick them up on his radar. As you go below a certain altitude on the MiG-23, the radar switches to be in a Doppler mode, not a pure return mode. And eventually, he just took a chance and tried to lock on to the proximate area where the Hercules might be. His radar locked on, and now another problem became evident. The radar was locked on, the missile could see the target, but it wasn't within launch parameters, because a Hercules, all the exhaust actually gets vented underneath the wing, not over the top of the wing. So the heat signature is underneath the wing. So unless you're around about the same altitude or lower than the Hercules, you can't get a launch quality lock on. So he had to go lower and lower and lower. He was still supersonic at that stage, brought the thrust lever back to idle, that thing. And eventually, in the middle of these hills over here, in a little single crew MiG, he was blasting along at about 200 meters above the ground at Mach 1. Closing in on these Hercules like thing. Got the lock on on the thing, finally got the launch parameters, and he launched the missile. Once that R-24T launches, it becomes totally autonomous. So then he said, oh, I don't want my bones to become part of the rocks in these hills, pitched up and turned away. And he didn't see what happened from there onwards. So what did happen? The Hercules guys were sitting there, all relaxed, and the next moment, this missile shot past their left wing. Came so close to the Hercules that it actually rocked the Hercules. Blinding flash, the missile was still accelerating and going at least Mach 3. There were a whole lot of fumes from the missile rocket motor that filled the cockpit. And as Mark said, there were some other fumes as well that filled the cockpit at the same time. And the missile shot off into the distance, and it just never exploded. So R-24T, if it passes within 8 meters of the heat source, is supposed to just explode proximity. Whatever happened to that missile had been transported all the way from Russia to Luanda, then bumpy roads and convoys. Something had happened to the proximity, and it just didn't explode. And it just shot off into the distance. Mark and the other Hercules, they dived down to even lower level and escaped. When they got back with the Hercules, they actually found the missile passed so close with the rocket motor still burning that it left a line of weld marks, little metal deposits like weld marks all the way down the Hercules fuselage. And you can chat to Mark later, he'll tell you that when he looked under the left wing in daylight, he could see between the two engines, the number 1 and number 2 engine, he could see actually a staining on the wing. That's how close that missile had got. Yeah, that's a better shot of what a R-24T looks like underneath the wing over there with its rounded head. That's the only photo I've ever managed to find in years of research of the MiG that launched the missile that night. It was MiG C409. Not a very good photo, but just interesting. That's the only photo I've ever found of it. Yeah, a bit of a postscript. So Mark and them diverted into Rundu. They did a damage check. They were convinced they'd been hit by something. There was nothing. It was just these little metal deposits. Russell and the other Hercules in the formation, Russell and them came on to Waterkloof. And then the next day, I've missed one point there. When this missile came so close, Adrian Woodley said, we're going down. Speaking to the other Hercules mean we're going to dive down low level. Somebody in the radio obviously picked it up and interpreted it as the Hercules is going down. It's been like shot down. Next day in the newspapers in Angola and also on the radio, there were all sorts of claims that they'd shot down the C-130. The SAF said, no ways, you never shot us down because we were never there. So you know how things go. So I got a hold of Victor Zazaraj, who was the private secretary to Pik Botha at the time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I said to Vic, what would the ramifications have been if the Hercules was shot down that night? He said it would have been a game changer for the war diplomatically, because at that stage, we had convinced everyone that we were only giving basic support to UNITA right along the Namibian border. We were never going deep into Angola. We had nothing to do with anything bad that happened there. And he said diplomatically it would have been really, really difficult for South Africa to come back from that and claim that we weren't involved directly in the war. Once again, button eyelash. The 4 guys who were in 4-1 that night, Adrian Woodley sitting in the right-hand seat, Mark, who looks like he's had another close shave there, and Dave Rouse, the navigator, and Louis van Wyk, who was sitting on the jump seat. He was going along for his first look-see ride on 20 Squadron to see what this drops into Angola were all about. So these guys were all given more than 30 years more life, and the person taking the photo is Mark's son, Keegan Binu, who would never have been conceived if that proximity fuse had worked that night. And there they are in front of Hercules 401, which is still flying even today. It's just come back from servicing, and recently it's been doing circuits and landings in Waterkloof. So 401 is just one of those stalwarts. It's still going. 2019, Mark approached me with an idea. Why don't we fly Eduardo out to South Africa so he can meet the guys he nearly shot down that night? So the two of us worked together, and we managed to get Eduardo out, and we took him to the SAF Museum in Swartkops. And this is him seeing Mirage 203, which is another chapter in the book in itself, that the whole story around that kill Mark, and that's an interesting story in itself. But Mirage 203, Le Spectre, and for Ed to come and he met a lot of the flummies and a lot of the guys he'd nearly shot down, it was really quite a special time. So here's Ed. We arranged a pub lunch, and the guys flew up from Cape Town, the guys flew up from Port Alfred, everything to meet Ed, all from the 2 Hercules crews. that night. And here's Ed in discussion with Louis van Wyk. The pub lunch started at 11 o'clock and was supposed to finish at about 3 o'clock. I think it finished 11:30, 12 o'clock that night. As Ed says, a lot of wine passed between the chest and spine. And our Louis van Wyk came up with one of the best comments. It's our Louis there. The next morning with his hangover, he WhatsApped me, he says, "This time the Cuban got me." Yeah, and there's the guys meeting at the late Russell S.B. Jones, and that's the guys who are flying in Hercules 402. So, you know, war is not a pretty thing. Anyone who's been involved in war will never be in favor of it, really. But what a wonderful thing if sometimes war can be like a rugby match where you knock the heck out of each other on the field, and then afterwards, when it's all done and dusted, everything's settled, you can have a beer with each other. So for me, that is why this is my favorite story in the book. Nobody gets hurt, and it ends with everybody having a beer in the end. Wouldn't it be wonderful if war could always end like that? And that's it from my side. Thanks very much, everyone. 24 Squadron did a strike against Lubongo in about 1983. I forget the date exactly. Okay, so I got the year right. So they did a strike against Lubongo. So right next to Lubongo Airfield is the SWAPO training camp. And these guys were getting tired of getting pasted by the SAP. So the Buccaneers came in, they did a strike, so they scrambled the MiG-21s to try and intercept the Buccaneers, but the Buccaneer was long gone. So when the MiG-21s returned to come and land, as they entered the landing pattern, their downwind took them right over the SWAPO training camp. And these guys were obviously jittery at that stage. So there was a lady missile operator who, as the MiG flew over the camp, busy putting his gear down, shot the MiG down with her missile, thinking it was... So she became the only lady in the whole war to actually get a kill. And I think, but Brian's claiming the kill as being from their strike that caused all the panic. So that's 24 Squadron definitely got a partial kill there.
We hear so much about the inefficiency of the SAAF now. How would you rate it?
No, I have very little to do with the thing, but I was at 21 Squadron, the VIP Squadron, the other day, taking some photos to help a friend of mine who's doing a book on battle honors. And they brought out the battle. And when I was at 21 Squadron, you know, things are very clean in the squadron, looked after, but they're short of money. You can see they're short of money, but there's still a lot of pride amongst the personnel. The biggest thing is the budget. Their budget is nothing. But the squadrons themselves, from what I have seen, operate as efficiently as possible that they can within their limitations. The problem is really at HQ. You know, that's where the problems are. The guys
are there many black pilots? The ratio of black to white?
Are probably 70% black and 20-30% white. Yeah. But you know, the pilots of all colour are just as passionate, and the guys are still very passionate about the Air Force. But they're very constrained in what they can do.
So, going back to when you were Lone Ranger and you were driving around with forward air control, and you got this guy sitting up top of the perch point there, and you're going to call him in, how much time have you got to get out of his way?
Well, you stay...
He's going to come in for his run from that perch point.
No, well, he comes in low level, so he's going to come in and almost do a 90, so you're going to bring him in, you're going to bring him to a point, you're going to pitch him, and he does a 90-degree pitch and fan onto the target. So the Mirage has got a 5 kilometer, 5,000 foot, and the Impalas are about a 2 kilometer, 2,000 foot. So you know where he's coming in because you got the IP. So you're going to send him on a heading from that IP. So you stay inside that heading. You know exactly where he's going to go in the heading. So it's easy for you to stay inside that elbow, and you do an orbit on the side of that elbow. So you deliver your rocket, and then you turn around hard. And as you turn around hard, you try to pick him up, and he'll be running in. So there's no danger from that perspective. You space yourself. You as the forward air controller have to give that gap. The jet has no idea where you are. He's just concentrating on weapons time and getting all his weapon switches ready. That's all he has to concentrate on. You basically take over the show.
Lionel, where are you from in South Africa? Where did you go to school?
Oh, it's primary school Durban, and then high school in Gauteng, Springs Boys High. Rough area. A funny story, you know, when we were in the Air Force and there's pupil pilots, you take quite a lot of abuse from the instructors. So there was a very sarcastic guy called Mark Dutton. And whenever you couldn't answer a question in the classroom, you say, "Where did you go to school, boy? Was it a special school?" And then the guys say, "No." They say, "Was it an agricultural school?" And then there was one guy in our course who had gone to agricultural school. So we said, "Was it an agricultural school?" The guy said, "Yes, Captain." When I reached out to Anton to get his version of what happened that night and everything, and he told me and how this missile came through, nearly missed their Hurricane thing. And then I told him what I knew from thing. He just said to me, "Listen, when you speak to Eduardo again, tell him he owes me a new pair of underpants." Oh, yeah, that was quite funny. So when we had this pub lunch, there were about 10 or 12 pilots there, and as usual, a couple of the pilots' wives, about 4 or 5 pilots' wives, and as always happens, the pilots get into a big cluster and speak shop, and the wives are left on their own in a little cluster. So after a while, one of the wives called Eduardo and said, "Eduardo, come here." And he went across to them, and he's like trying to all his Cuban charm, and they said to him, "Eduardo, we are very angry with you." And he was like, "Oh, but why? I missed." They said, "Exactly."